The sweeping plains and mountains of southeastern Arizona. Once these lands formed an empire that belonged to the Apache Nation. It was home to legendary chiefs and warriors, Cochise, Mangus Coloradus, and the most famous of all, Geronimo.
But others came here, past the shadows of the Dragoon and the Chiricahua Mountains, soldiers with names like Miles, Crook, Crawford, and Gatewood. For the next half hour, we'll tell you about both groups of people, especially the Apache named Geronimo.
Well, in my eyes, he's a good man for the Indians and a bad man for the white man.
I think I would say he was bad for the Indians. I mean, he led them to disaster.
We feel this way. We wouldn't be here today if he hadn't surrendered.
5,000 U.S. Army soldiers chased Geronimo and his band of about 35 renegades. His reputation was notorious in this country and in Mexico. We'll never know if he did everything he was accused of, but his surrender 100 years ago marked the end of the Indian Wars, the last surrender of the first Americans.
Arizona Legacy. Geronimo will continue in a moment.
This is where it all began for Geronimo. He was born in the 1820s. Historians disagree on what year, and they're not even sure of his birthplace.
Geronimo said he was born in Nadoyan Canyon near the headwaters of the Gila River. Now, that would be somewhere around here, just south of the present-day town of Clifton, Arizona. And while we'll never be certain of the exact spot, Geronimo knew, to an Apache, the place of one's birth has some very strong personal and also spiritual meanings.
The youth who would later be called Geronimo was named Goyakla. The English translation is he who yawns. Life then was good. The Apaches traveled throughout the West, often going south into Mexico on trading expeditions.
South of here in Mexico, something happened that changed young Geronimo's life and the course of history forever. Mexican troops raided his camp while he was away, and that raid turned into a massacre.
Geronimo returned to find the bodies of his mother, 3 children, and his wife. It was not going to be the only time he'd lose family members so violently. The bloody trail his life would now take would be marked with graves.
He lost 2 families that were just massacred, you might say. And when he came back from his visit someplace else where he came back and found his family strewn all over and dead, wife and children and all. And that was his family, and he made a vow that he would kill every Mexican and every white man that he saw.
The Apache leader sought and got bloody revenge. Dying Mexican soldiers called out for Saint Jerome, Santo Geronimo. From that cry, the similar-sounding names and the legend of Geronimo began. With that rebirth, Geronimo gained the reputation throughout the Apache tribe of a medicine man.
Sometimes they asked for big wind, and the wind came. Sometimes they asked for rain, and the rain came. And this is one way that they eluded the soldiers.
But by the 1860s, even Geronimo's powers couldn't keep out the white man. Settlers and miners moved in, leaving the Civil War and crowded east behind them. The soldiers came too, at first on war campaigns, crossing Arizona with the permission of the mighty Apache leader Cochise. They left for a while, adding their strength to the Civil War. But then they returned, and this time for good.
And just around that time, there were two major events that happened. An Army trap detained Chief Cochise for a short time. The other event was far more brutal, the murder and beheading of the great chief Mangus Coloradus. The Indian Wars literally exploded.
Apache Pass in southeastern Arizona, the year 1862. When the smoke had cleared, 66 Apaches lay dead, all but 3 killed by cannon fire. It was the first time the Indians had fought against cannons. Fort Bowie was established nearby that same year. While only remnants of the adobe walls stand today, they're ghostly reminders of the Indian Wars that lasted for more than 20 years. In northern Arizona, Fort Apache was established, along with a reservation for the White Mountain Apache Indians.
In 1871, an unorthodox whiskered army man, General George Crook, arrived here at Fort Apache. He changed the soldiers' basic fighting tactics to closer match that of the Apaches. He also enlisted Indians on the reservation as scouts.
He was the greatest general in all of the West. He came to Arizona in 1870, went up to Fort Verde, built that road across to Fort Apache, established a network of offensive and defensive posts, subdued the Apaches, set up a reservation system, and then said, with force must also come compassion and a plan.
Crook understood and knew how to fight renegade Apaches. He also fought against Washington bureaucrats who closed down existing Apache reservations, one by one, crowding most of the Indians onto the San Carlos Reservation. Geronimo was part of the Chiricahua and the Warm Springs group who was moved there. Now, 4,000 people were crowded onto land that was intended for only 800. That's when General Crook was transferred out of Arizona.
Had he been left to administer the Apaches after he defeated them in 1872, I think all the tragedy would have been averted.
This was the time that Geronimo earned the names of renegade and troublemaker, as twice he broke out from the crowded reservation.
He tried to protect his land, the land that he said it belongs to the Apache people.
The reason that he lives on as a symbol for Indians, I think, is obvious. He beat the white man again and again and again against overwhelming odds.
By 1885, tensions were as high as they could go. General Crook had returned to Arizona, but he had to work all over again to gain back the trust of the Indians. Finally, encouraged and led by Geronimo, 42 warriors and 90 women and children fled south to Mexico. Chiefs Nana, Chihuahua, and the son of Cochise, Geronimo's friend Naiche, went with them. The press had a field day.
Well, bear in mind, too, that Geronimo, in his guerrilla activities, was occurring between wars. It's the same today. We in the press go where the action is, and he did not have a Middle East or a Vietnam competing with him on the pages, and so that's where the press went to look for the thrills of the day, and of course he provided them.
For the next 15 months, Geronimo and his band hid out in Mexico, making raids into Arizona for supplies, horses, and ammunition. For the most part, the hostiles used weapons superior to the armies. They were guerrilla fighters, hit-and-run raiders who could not be caught.
He resisted the occupation of a tract of land larger than France and Germany combined. He tied down 1/2 of the combat troops of the United States of America.
He was a pretty
shrewd and clever outdoorsman. He knew the country. He had everything going for him. The soldiers had to take all the trappings with them. The Apaches lived off the country.
Legends speak of Geronimo's great power that kept him from being captured, how he could turn himself into trees, cactus, or animals. Some ranchers, like the Wright brothers in southeastern Arizona, were killed trying to recover stolen livestock from the renegades.
They'd been beaten about the head and face until, his mother said, they were beyond recognition, is her words for it. They couldn't recognize which was which. In fact, they were buried in a single grave, the two of them.
While there were killings and occasional raids, they weren't widespread, but the terror and fear they generated across the country was.
Well, if you lived in southeastern Arizona, I suspect it was living with a certain amount of terror, wondering what would happen at night, worrying about where the menfolk would be in the day when they were out on the range, and never knowing when something might simply strike out of clear blue sky. It was a tough time in Arizona.
The pressure was now on Washington and the Army to do something. In 1886, Apache scouts managed to make contact with Geronimo's camp. That led to a meeting 2 months later with General Crook and Geronimo in Mexico. The Apache leaders agreed to surrender and to 2 years of imprisonment in the east, followed by a return to Arizona. But on the way back, they heard a rumor that they would be murdered. Geronimo, Naiche, and over 30 others fled back into the Mexico mountains. General Crook returned to Fort Bowie with only part of the Chiricahua renegade band. As far as Washington was concerned, he returned in disgrace, for he was without Geronimo.
He made Crook look foolish. He led the best of the post-war United States Army on an incredible chase. He made a mockery out of the power of the entire United States government.
Crook was replaced by General Nelson Appleton Miles, a very ambitious man.
In recent times, when General Miles is debated in certain historical circles, his defenders are hard put to deny that he had an ego larger than Custer.
General Miles was determined to capture Geronimo and the glory that went with it. Once again, Apache scouts went into Mexico, this time with Lieutenant Charles Gatewood, a man Geronimo knew and trusted. The scouts brought word that Geronimo would meet with him. Moments were tense as the Apache hostiles rode up, but Geronimo was ready to make peace for himself and his children.
Not just his kids, you know, the rest of the men's kids too, you know, and their women, you know, slowed him down, you know. Yeah. That's why he surrendered. He was looking at their best interests, you know.
Geronimo trusted Gatewood, but he told him he wanted to meet General Miles face to face.
Frantic messages were sent to General Miles begging him to come and accept the surrender. But it wasn't until September 3rd that he finally met them here at Skeleton Canyon.
The next day, Geronimo and Miles talked through interpreters. Miles drew a line saying it represented the ocean. At one end, he placed a rock saying that was the ones who went in earlier with Crook. At the other end, he placed 2 stones, which he said represented Geronimo, also the Chiricahuas who remained on the reservation in Arizona. The Great White Father in Washington, Miles said, wanted all the Chiricahuas to be together with the ones who surrendered earlier. What Miles did not say was that would be in prison in Florida. Not knowing this fact, Geronimo agreed and surrendered. Within a few days, Geronimo and the rest of the renegades were loaded up on a train bound for Florida. An Army band played Auld Lang Syne as the once mighty Apache warriors were shipped out, along with the Apache Army scouts who found them.
I don't know how we can call it anything but one of the blackest traitorous acts in American history, that we sent the loyal Indian scouts into exile along with the hostiles.
Also loaded into cattle cars bound for Florida were all of the Chiricahua and Warm Springs Apaches who had lived the entire time in peace on the reservation, men, women, and children.
Geronimo's people got a very raw deal. The Chiricahua Apaches, most of whom were not involved in the depredations, most of them who were not followers of Geronimo, suffered as grievously as he did in captivity.
The Indian Wars were over. The exile was beginning.
An Arizona legacy. Geronimo will be back in just a moment.
I was born in 1910 as a prisoner of war. My mother and father were prisoners of war.
For the next 26 years, all the Chiricahuas, including those born during that time, were prisoners of war of the United States government. Nearly 400 Apaches were shipped first to Florida. In the hot, humid climate, tuberculosis claimed many lives quickly, including another wife and daughter of Geronimo. Over and over, the death song was sung.
A lot of people there that I talked to in town and then at the Historical Society told me that in 1978, they were still hearing cries of the Apaches there. Every evening you could still hear them cry out there, hear them sing.
From Florida, the prisoners were moved to Alabama. 7 years later, they were finally transferred to the life-saving, drier climate of Fort Sill, Oklahoma. The first night on the plains was bittersweet for the Apaches.
And when it got dark, they heard the coyotes howling, and it just brought back memories to the old folks. And the little old women started crying because they said, "Oh, we're near home."
But for the next 19 years, it would be the closest they'd ever get to their native Arizona.
For years and years after his capture, Geronimo begged the authorities in Washington to let him come back here to his home in Arizona, but it was never to be.
So instead, Geronimo adapted even to the point of appearing in World's Fairs and riding in President Roosevelt's inaugural parade in 1905.
Many a man would have just dried up and gone into a shell, and yet Geronimo was able to participate in a presidential inauguration. He went all over the world in carnivals. He sold phony bows and arrows to the tourists. He sewed the buttons back on his shirt at night and then resold them to the curious the next day.
While the Apaches had freedom of the Fort Sill area, they were still watched closely. Like other Apache prisoners of war, Geronimo learned new ways of survival.
We were taught. Now, when they are real friendly with you, when the white people are real friendly with you, you be careful. You look around you and see what you have that they want.
The once powerful medicine man even became a good farmer, famous for his watermelons. He was also famous for his stories, like the one about Medicine Bluffs.
The legend is that two young Comanches were competing for the same girl, and one of them ran the other over the bluffs. Another legend states that a medicine man jumped his horse off. Geronimo adopted this legend to himself and used it to further his career selling souvenirs. This is where the paratroopers get to Geronimo when they jump out of the airplane.
Geronimo's days at Fort Sill were also marked by drinking binges in the nearby town of Leatham.
One morning my mother went out to start her laundry, and right behind her wash tubs was this Indian. She let out a scream and ran in the house to get some help, and my dad came out there and found Geronimo back there asleep, just passed out. So he took care of him and got things all calmed down, and I think it scared Geronimo worse than it did my mother.
After that, the old warrior, now well into his 80s, often slept off too much whiskey on the family's back porch.
He knew that's someplace he could go that they wouldn't put him in jail, and he just didn't want to be locked up anymore.
But on a cold February morning, Geronimo didn't make it back. Too drunk to stay on his horse, he fell into the muddy, wet road. He was nearly half frozen when he was discovered. Pneumonia developed, and in its grip, Geronimo rambled over and over again about his raids, of his days as a warrior. But on February 17, 1909, Geronimo surrendered for the last time. In 1912, exile ended for the Apaches at Fort Sill, even though they were still not allowed to return to Arizona. 183 went to New Mexico and were absorbed in the Mescalero Apache tribe. 82 remained at Fort Sill and were given money to buy land, but not very much.
We used to own the whole West over there, man. Arizona, California, New Mexico.
Arizona?
Yeah. Here, all we get is 160 acres. God damn! We own the whole damn West, and we get 160 acres in Oklahoma.
Yeah.
Over 300 of the Fort Sill Chiricahuas live today, scattered about the country. 100 years later, there's a mixture of bitterness and hope.
We're slowly dying out, you know. Yeah. Slowly but surely, one of these days, there ain't gonna be no Apaches. That's it.
Times have changed, and we have to live for today. And we've learned forgiveness, and that's what we do.
100 years have passed since the surrender of Geronimo. The powerful medicine man has been dead for 74 years now, but the legacy lives on.
Here's a man who could go to one spectrum of depravity on the one hand and ride with the President of the United States the next. He was, if anything, rather a Renaissance Indian.
The spirit of Geronimo lives on, and as an Apache, somehow or not, you feel that way. It's always within you. It never went.
I can't think of Arizona without Geronimo. It would be a lifeless place, devoid of the myth and the legend. And he's a great example to all of us. If he wasn't a great leader, he was a great fighter, renegade. He speaks a lot of this individualism, this self-reliance that is so much at the heart of what the West is all about.
While he was never allowed physically to return here to Arizona, I'm sure his spirit did. That's the one thing that could never be conquered. And maybe that's Geronimo's ultimate triumph, for while other people are remembered for what they have done, Geronimo will simply be remembered and never forgotten. Good night.